Emmanuel Levinas in Totality and Infinity is presenting us with a privileged sort of event in our life, in our experience. It's an event that is, in fact, constitutive of our entire grasp of the world and of ourself and of each other. It's one that is utterly resistant to our comprehending it, our understanding it, our confronting it. But it is nonetheless an event and an experience that has this absolute primary effect on our being, on our life, and our understanding of the world. It's this encounter with otherness, which he describes as being face to face with the other, or which he describes just simply as the encounter of the face and the expressivity of the face. And what this event accomplishes is to call into question our own being. It is to call into question force, habit, and momentum by which life carries forward, by which we indulge in our daily actions, in which we find enjoyment, and in which we find ourselves at home in the world and in our being and in our momentum that carries us forward. So this first encounter with otherness is a disruption to this force, and it is a calling into question of this force. But it's this event that actually makes this force come to light. It is in our encounter with another, in our encounter with the face, that the idea of a self, that the idea of this inner force, which going back to Spinoza is called conatus, this effort, this striving, our being as a striving living entity is opened and becomes intelligible, becomes an idea, becomes something comprehensible, when we encounter that which is incomprehensible, when we encounter that which goes beyond our sphere, that which opens us to a new way of looking at ourselves, which is in fact the first time we ever look at ourselves, right? This is how primordial of an experience. He says that the face opens the primordial discourse whose first word is obligation. And this obligation is so fundamental and primary and escapable and unsurmountable that no interiority could ever avoid it. It does not permit us avoiding the call and the summons that the encounter with the other calls out to us. Let's think about this a bit more. When we encounter another, we encounter what we are incapable of ever containing prior to this encounter. This is the encounter of something that we don't understand, that we don't already have a sort of prototype in our past experiences. We do not subsume or we do not subjugate the other to the same. We do not encounter this difference and then assimilate it to our self. This is exactly what Levinas finds in Descartes, especially in the third meditation, and this is where ego, a cogito, an activity of consciousness, which is self-sufficient in some sense, is capable of thinking and has some kind of clarity in its own being when it thinks. It comes in contact with something other, with something anterior or exterior, which is completely overflowing it. Its content, while we, encounter its content and we have the content of the infinite in our thinking, we also experience our incapacity. We experience the excess of this thought beyond our thinking. It's something that we can only come into relation to and that we can desire and that we can, gravitate towards, but we will never possess it, we will never contain it, and we will never dominate it. Rather than seeing a merely epistemological or metaphysical implication, Levinas finds a moral implication and sees this experience of the other and the experience of infinity as radically the same thing. and that there is this deep metaphysical aspect to our encounter with the other and the face. Levinas understands this in relation not only to language, but in relation to moral, ethical, even criminological event of murder. And he looks at the fact that the encounter of a face shows us a sort of potentiality for violence, and also a call from our conscience, we might say, but a conscience that is outside of us, a conscience that is in the face of the other itself, that says that the other cannot be killed, that there's no power we can exercise over the other to completely dominate and annihilate. We can, through our intellect and through our movement away from the ethical, this whole tendency is what Levinas refers to by war, violence. He connects these ideas of the intellect and putting everything under the same light and removing the moral dimension of our experience and leaving only the intellectual, that these are the same movements that happen in war, and that the encounter with the other shows us not only the potential of our violence, but also our impotence in actually ever doing what murder and war claim to do. He says, I can wish to kill only an existent, absolutely independent, which exceeds my powers infinitely, and therefore does not oppose them, but paralyzes that very power. The other is the sole being I can wish to kill. And then says a little bit further on that it is the only being that I am incapable of killing. He says, this infinity, stronger than murder, already resists us in his face, and in his face, in the primordial expression, in his first word, thou shalt not commit murder. The infinite paralyzes power by its infinite resistance to murder, which, firm and insurmountable, gleams in the face of the other, in the total nudity of its defenseless eye, in the nudity of the absolute openness of the transcendent. The face, above all, is something that contests the struggle of being, right? Being and our continuing in existence as a kind of struggle. This is, implied to some degree in the idea of the conatus and the striving, right? The encounter with the face throws into question this struggle of being. It calls into question our freedom as striving beings, and it calls into question power. As Levinas says, radically transforms our idea of power, because power becomes our responsibility to show up to the face, to show up to the other, and not be empty-handed, as he says. The face presents us, he uses terms like nudity and vulnerability, and that it is encounter with destitution and hunger. And it not only imposes itself on my freedom and shows me my freedom, but it arouses my goodness. And this is a different power altogether, right? It shows this in a rather grievous or severe sense. He says that it shows the severity and of the seriousness of goodness. That goodness isn't just some kind of playful frivolity, but it is something that we encounter when we encounter the other as destitute, hungry, as another for whom we are responsible and to whom we are called to respond. I'm going to end just by reading a few pages of Totality and Infinity on the ethics of the face. Emmanuel Levinas, Totality and Infinity, an essay on exteriority, Section 3, Chapter B, Ethics and the Face. Section 1, Infinity and the Face. Inasmuch as access to beings concerns vision, it dominates these beings, exercises a power over them. A thing is given, offers itself to me. In gaining access to it, I maintain myself within the same. The face is present in its refusal to be contained. In this sense, it cannot be comprehended, that is, encompassed. It is neither seen nor touched, for in visual or tactile sensation, the identity that I envelop and the alterity of the object, which becomes precisely a content. The other is not other with a relative alterity, as are, in a comparison, even ultimate species, which mutually exclude one another, but still have their place within the community of a genus, excluding one another by their definition, but calling for one another by their exclusion across the community of their genus. The alterity of the other does not depend on any quality that would distinguish it from me, for a distinction of this nature would precisely imply between us that community of genus which already nullifies alterity. And yet the other does not purely and simply negate the I, total negation of which murder is the temptation and the attempt refers to an antecedent relation. The relation between the other and me, which dawns forth in this expression, issues neither in number nor in concept. The other remains infinitely transcendent, infinitely foreign. His face in which his epiphany is produced and which appeals to me breaks with the world that can be common to us. Those virtualities are inscribed in our nature and developed by our existence. Speech proceeds from absolute difference. Or more exactly, an absolute difference is not produced in a process of specification descending from genus to species, in which the order of logical relations runs up against the given, which is not reducible to relations. The difference thus encountered remains bound up with the logical hierarchy it contrasts with, and appears against the background of the common genus. Absolute difference, inconceivable in terms of formal logic, is established only by language. Language accomplishes a relation between terms that breaks up the unity of a genus. The terms, the interlocutors, absolve themselves from the relation, or rather, remain absolute within relationship. Language is perhaps to be defined as the very power to break the continuity of being or of history. The incomprehensible nature of the presence of the other, which we spoke of above, is not to be described negatively. Better than comprehension, discourse relates with what remains essentially transcendent. For the moment, we must attend to the formal work of language, which consists in presenting the transcendent. A more profound signification will emerge shortly. Language is a relation between separated terms. To the one, the other can indeed present himself as a theme, but his presence is not reabsorbed in his status as a theme. The word that bears on the other as a theme seems to contain the other, but already it is said to the other, who, as interlocutor, has quite the theme that encompasses him, and upsurges inevitably behind the said. Words are said, be it only by the silence kept, whose weight acknowledges this evasion of the other. The knowledge that absorbs the other is forthwith situated within the discourse I address to him. Speaking, rather than letting be, solicits the other. Speech cuts across vision. In knowledge or vision, the object seen can indeed determine an act, but it is an act that in some way appropriates the seen to itself integrates it into a world by endowing it with a signification, and in the last analysis, constitutes it. In discourse, the divergence that inevitably opens between the other as my theme and the other as my interlocutor, emancipated from the theme that seemed a moment to hold him, forthwith contests the meaning I ascribe to my interlocutor. The formal structure of language thereby announces the ethical inviolability of the other, and with my odor of the numinous, his holiness. The fact that the face maintains a relation with me by discourse does not range him in the same. He remains absolute within the relation. The solipsist dialectic of consciousness, always suspicious of being in captivity in the same, breaks off. For the ethical relation which subtends discourse is not a species of consciousness whose ray emanates from the eye. It puts the I in question. This putting in question emanates from the other. The presence of a being not entered into, but overflowing. The sphere of the same determines its status as infinite. This overflowing is to be distinguished from the image of liquid overflowing a vessel, because this overflowing presence is effectuated as a position in the face of the same. The facing position, opposition par excellence, can only be as a moral summons. This movement proceeds from the other. The idea of infinity, the infinitely more contained in the less, is concretely produced in the form of a relation with the face. And the idea of infinity alone maintains the exteriority of the other with respect to the same, despite this relation. Thus, a structure analogous to the ontological argument is here produced. The exteriority of a being is inscribed in its essence. But what is produced here is not a reasoning, but an epiphany that occurs as a face. The metaphysical desire for the absolutely other, which animates intellectualism, or the radical empiricism that confides in the teaching of exteriority, deploys its energy in the vision of the face, or in the idea of infinity. The idea of infinity exceeds my powers, and not quantitatively, but, we will see later, by calling them into question. It does not come from our a priori depths. It is consequently experience par excellence. The Kantian notion of infinity figures as an ideal of reason, the projection of its exigencies in a beyond, the ideal completion of what is given incomplete. But without the incomplete being confronted with a privileged experience of infinity, without it drawing the limits of its finitude from such a confrontation, the finite is here no longer conceived by relation to the infinite. Quite the contrary, the infinite presupposes the finite, which it amplifies infinitely. Although this passage to the limit, or this projection, implicates in an unacknowledged form the idea of infinity, with all the consequences Descartes drew from it, and which are presupposed in the idea of projection. The Kantian finitude is prescribed positively by sensibility, as the Heideggerian finitude by the being for death. The infinity referring to the finite marks the most anti-Cartesian point of Kantian philosophy, as later of Heideggerian philosophy. Hegel returns to Descartes in maintaining the positivity of the infinite, but excluding all multiplicity from it. He posits the infinite as the exclusion of every other that might maintain a relation with the infinite and thereby limit it. The infinite can only encompass all relations. like the God of Aristotle, it refers only to itself, though now at the term of a history. The relation of a particular with infinity would be equivalent to the entry of this particular into the sovereignty of a state. It becomes infinity in negating its own finitude. But this outcome does not succeed in smothering the protestation of the private individual, the apology of the separated being, although it be called empirical and animal, of the individual who experiences as a tyranny the state willed by his reason, but in whose impersonal destiny he no longer recognizes his reason. We recognize in the finitude to which the Hegelian infinite is opposed and which it encompasses the finitude of man before the elements, the finitude of man invaded by the there is, Ilia, at each instant traversed by faceless gods against whom labor is pursued in order to realize security in which the other of the elements would be revealed as the same. But the other, absolutely other, the other, does not limit the freedom of the same. Calling it to responsibility, it founds it and justifies it. The relationship with the other as face heals allergy. It is desire, teaching received, and the pacific opposition of discourse. In returning to the Cartesian notion of infinity, the idea of infinity put in the separated being by the infinite, we retain its positivity, its anteriority to every finite thought, and every thought of the finite. Its exteriority with regard to the finite, here, there, was the possibility of separated being. The idea of infinity, the overflowing of the finite thought by its content, effectuates the relation of thought with what exceeds its capacity, with what at each moment it learns without suffering shock. This is the situation we call welcome of the face. The idea of infinity is produced in the opposition of conversation in sociability. The relation with the face, with the other, absolutely other, which I cannot contain, the other in this sense infinite, is nevertheless my idea, a commerce. But the relation is maintained without violence, in peace with the absolute alterity. The resistance of the other does not do violence to me, does not act negatively, it has a positive structure, ethical. The first revelation of the other, presupposed in all the other relations with him, does not consist in grasping him in his negative resistance and in circumventing him by ruse. I do not struggle with a faceless God, but I respond to his expression, to his revelation. Section 2, Ethics and the Face. The face resists possession, resists my powers. It is epiphany. In expression, the sensibility still graspable turns into total resistance to the grasp. This mutation can occur only by the opening of a new dimension. For the resistance to the grasp is not produced as an insurmountable resistance, like the hardness of the rock against which the effort of the hand comes to nigh, like the remoteness of a star in the immensity of space. The expression the face introduces into the world does not defy the feebleness of my powers, but my ability for power. The face, still a thing among things, breaks through the form that nevertheless delimits it. This means concretely, the face speaks to me and thereby invites me to a relation incommensurate with a power exercised, be it enjoyment or knowledge. And yet this new dimension opens in the sensible appearance of the face. The permanent openness of the contours of its form in expression imprisons this openness, which breaks up form in a caricature. The face, at the limit of holiness and caricature, is thus still, in a sense, exposed to powers. In a sense only. The depth that opens in the sensibility modifies the very nature of power, which henceforth can no longer take, but can kill. Murder still aims at a sensible datum, and yet it finds itself before a datum whose being cannot be suspended by an appropriation. It finds itself before a datum absolutely non-neutralizable. The negation affected by appropriation and usage remained always partial. The grasp that contests the independence of the thing preserves it for me. Neither the destruction of things, nor the hunt, nor the extermination of living beings aims at the face, which is not of this world. They still belong to labor, have a finality, and answer to a need. Murder alone lays claim to total negation. Negation by labor and usage, like negation by representation, affect a grasp or a comprehension, rest on or aim at affirmation. They can. To kill is not to dominate, but to annihilate. It is to renounce comprehension absolutely. Murder exercises a power over what escapes power. It is still a power, for the face expresses itself in the sensible, but already impotency, because the face renders the sensible. The alterity that is expressed in the face provides the unique matter possible for total negation. I can wish to kill only an existent, absolutely independent, which exceeds my powers infinitely, and therefore does not oppose them, but paralyzes the very power of power. The other is the sole being I can wish to kill. But how does this disproportionate between infinity and my power differ from that which separates a very great obstacle from a force implied to it? It would be pointless to insist on the banality of murder, which reveals the quasi-null resistance of the obstacle. This most banal incident of human history corresponds to an exceptional possibility, since it claims the total negation of a being. It does not concern the force that this being may possess as a part of the world. The other, who can sovereignly say no to me, is exposed to the point of the sword or the revolver's bullet, and the whole unshakable firmness of his for itself, with that intransigent no he opposes, is obliterated, because the sword or the bullet has touched the ventricles or oracles of his heart. In the contexture of the world, he is a quasi-nothing. But he can oppose to me a struggle, that is, oppose to the force that strikes him, not a force of resistance, but the very unforeseeableness of his reaction. He thus opposes to me not a great force, an energy accessible and consequently presenting itself as though it were a part of a whole, but the very transcendence of his being, a relation to the whole, not some superlative of power, but precisely the infinity of his transcendence. This infinity, stronger than murder, already resists us in his face. In his face is the primordial expression. in the first word, "You shall not commit murder." The infinite paralyzes power by its infinite resistance to murder, which, firm and insurmountable, gleams in the face of the other, in the total nudity of his defenseless face, in the nudity of the absolute otherness of the transcendent. There is here a relation, not with a very great resistance, but with something absolutely other, the resistance of what has no resistance, the ethical resistance. The epiphany of the face brings forth the possibility of gauging the infinity of the temptation to murder, not only as a temptation to total destruction, but also as the purely ethical impossibility of this temptation and attempt. If the resistance to murder were not ethical but real, we would have a perception of it, with all that reverts to the subjective in perception. We would remain within the idealism of a consciousness of struggle, and not in relationship with the other, a relationship that can turn itself into struggle, but already overflows the consciousness of struggle. The epiphany of the face is ethical. The struggle this face can threaten presupposes the transcendence of expression. The face threatens the eventuality of a struggle, but this threat does not exhaust the epiphany of infinity, does not formulate its first word. War presupposes peace, the antecedent and non-allergic presence of the other. It does not represent the first event of the encounter. The impossibility of killing does not have a single negative and formal signification. The relation with infinity, the idea of infinity in us, conditions it positively. Infinity presents itself as a face in the ethical resistance that paralyzes my powers, and from the depths of defenseless eyes rises firm and absolute in its nudity and destitution. The comprehension of this destitution and this hunger establishes the very proximity of the other. But thus, the epiphany of infinity is expression and discourse. The primordial essence of expression and discourse does not reside in the information they would supply concerning the interiority and hidden world. In expression, a being presents itself. The being that manifests itself attends its manifestations and consequently appeals to me. This attendance is not the neutrality of an image, but the solicitation that concerns me by its destitution and its height. To speak to me is at each moment to surmount what is necessarily plastic in manifestation. To manifest oneself as a face is to impose oneself above and beyond the manifested and purely phenomenal form. To present oneself in a mode irreducible to manifestation, the very straightforwardness of the face to the face, without the intermediary of an image, in one's nudity, that is, in one's destitution and hunger. In desire are conjoined the movements into the height and unto the humility of the other. Expression does not radiate as a splendor that spreads unbeknown to the radiating being, which is perhaps the definition of beauty. To manifest oneself in attending one's own manifestation is to invoke the interlocutor and to expose oneself to his response and his questioning. Expression does not impose itself as a true representation or as an action. The being offered in true representation remains a possibility of appearance. The world which invades me when I engage myself in it is powerless against the free thought that suspends that engagement or even refuses it interiorly, being capable of living hidden. The being that expresses itself imposes itself, but does so precisely by appealing to me with its destitution and nudity, its hunger, without my being able to be deaf to the appeal. Thus, an expression, the being that imposes itself, does not limit but promotes my freedom by arousing my goodness. The order of responsibility, or the gravity of ineluctable being, freezes all laughter. In also the order where freedom is inevitably evoked, it is thus the irremissible weight of being that gives rise to my freedom. The ineluctable has no longer an inhumanity of the fateful, but the severe seriousness of goodness. This bond between expression and responsibility, this ethical condition or essence of language, this function of language prior to all discourse of being and its cold splendor, permits us to extract language from subjection to a pre-existent thought, where it would have but the servile function of translating that pre-existent thought on the outside, or of universalizing its internal movement. The presentation of the face is not true, for the true refers to the non-true, its eternal contemporary. And ineluctable meets with the smile and silence of the skeptic. The presentation of being in the face does not leave any logical place for its contradictory. Thus, I cannot evade by silence the discourse which the epiphany that occurs as a face opens, as Thrasymachus, irritated, tries to do in the first book of the Republic. Moreover, without succeeding. Quote, "To leave men without food is a fault that no circumstance attenuates. The distinction between the voluntary and the involuntary does not apply here," says Rabbi Yochanan. Before the hunger of men, responsibility is measured only objectively. It is irrescuable. The face opens the primordial discourse whose first word is obligation, which no interiority permits avoiding. It is that discourse that obliges the entering into discourse, and the commencement of discourse rationalism prays for, a force that convinces even the people who do not wish to listen, and thus founds the true universality of reason. Pre-existing the discourse of being in general, taken as basis of knowledge and as meaning of being in the relation with the existent that expresses himself, pre-existing the plane of ontology is the ethical plane.